Gun violence in this country is an epidemic, and it's an international embarrassment.
President Biden coming out with his political guns blazing last week, announcing executive actions on gun safety. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Among other steps, Biden plans to crack down on so-called ghost guns, firearms assembled from kits without serial numbers. But any major action on gun reform has to go through Congress. And when most Republicans think curbing ghost guns threatens Second Amendment rights, what's the chance they'll go along with background checks or an assault weapons ban? Just about zero. Then there's Biden's proposed budget, over $1.5 trillion, with a 16% increase in domestic spending on things like education and health research. That's on top of his $2.3 trillion infrastructure package. That includes hundreds of billions of dollars in spending on programs that have nothing to do with roads and bridges. Biden making a big, bold bet that expanding government is the way to address America's problems. And keep in mind, this agenda needs support from West Virginia Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, who has emerged as a Senate superpower. So who's Joe Biden in the Oval Office, the centrist, Senate dealmaker, or a born-again progressive? We're joined by Mark Leibovich, the chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine, and Matt Flegenheimer, a national political reporter for the Times, who's got an article this week in the Times Magazine about Governor Andrew Cuomo. And welcome to both of you. Mark, let me ask you, how did we leap into this era of big government all of a sudden? If we go back to the comparisons with FDR and the New Deal, you see big business supporting him to some extent because they were afraid of worse things, of socialism, even of communism. But now big business seems to be at least lukewarm to Biden. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I think big business obviously it's not a monolithic phenomena, but I also think that President Biden has sort of seized control of the country at a time when it's basically a traumatic time. I mean, COVID is still very much in the ravages of COVID are still very much front and center in the American debate. They're affecting people, they're affecting the economy. And he sees this, compared to the pretty stark juxtaposition between him and his predecessor, as an opportunity to really kind of launch some pretty dramatic changes in the way government fundamentally works. And look, I think big business has come along to some degree, but I also think that when you get down to tax increases, which I think is going to probably be a big part of paying for some of this latest stuff, it's going to meet, I think, probably more vigorous resistance from big business.
Matt, is this the Joe Biden that you expected to see as president? We saw a lot of guessing as to what kind of president he would be, what kind of mindset he would have, what kind of path he would straddle to accommodate liberals and others. Are you surprised at this version of Joe Biden?
I think you're seeing, and certainly his supporters would say as much, an adaptability from somebody who is obviously a man of the Senate, a man of institutions, a Washington veteran. I think there's a recognition, given the state of the Republican Party in this moment, that they're trying to sort of reframe what bipartisanship can mean. And it might not mean getting any Republican votes or major legislation. They've tried to make the case that on the sort of bigger, bolder initiatives that he's pushing, having any kind of broad support among the public, among voters, can suffice and sort of be made to connect with his broader kind of paeans to unity and healing the nation that he ran on, even if he's not necessarily getting that in the form of bipartisan legislation.
Are we still, Mark, in a honeymoon period, a first 100-day period where a lot of this is going to pass? Or is this wishful thinking on the part of the White House?
Probably wishful thinking, but I also think that look, I mean, I think what we've seen in the first 100 days or so, or nearly 100 days of this administration, is that I think the style of sort of having a bipartisan spirit, at least, his inaugural address, President Biden sort of having Republicans into the White House and so forth, remains something that he's striving to do. But I also think has shown very little hesitation. I think far less hesitation than people expected to act alone and to act fairly boldly as far as, putting out some packages and some proposals with some big price tags associated with it that people were not expecting. And I think Republicans don't really know quite how to respond to just yet. I think one thing that's worth noting is that President Biden, if there is one thing he has taken from the Trump playbook, and I'm sure they would, hate to hear this, but they have actually emphasized public opinion far more than the Obama years did. They have been very quick to talk about how popular some of these new gun measures have been, how popular infrastructure has been, how popular the COVID relief packages have been. Putting some pretty big, plus 50, 60% numbers on these things to sort of define bipartisanship, as Matt just said, in a way that's more conducive to their argument. So I think that that's sort of part of what they've been doing, but I think to this point, it's been pretty effective.
Matt, one of the things that follows up on what Mark is saying is we wrote not long ago in the Times that big business, which had really supported the Black Lives Matter movement, certainly supported it in print, supported it in principle, was shying away a little more when it came to voting rights. Now we see a little bit more aggressive movement on that issue from big business, from the corporate world. Why do we see that now? Why do you think that is? Is that part of a shift in public opinion as well?
It might just be, it's a fascinating undercurrent and an important one to all of this. I do think, a sustained sort of public pressure campaign with some of these corporations, from activists, from voting rights advocates, Black Lives Matter protesters, from others, has made a real difference. There's a real infrastructure to that sort of protest energy now. And I certainly do think, and there's sort of an organized kind of higher level executive conversation happening on the left, trying to push some of these corporations in that same direction. But there is certainly more of a willingness to potentially move off of the sort of attempt at being apolitical that you've seen from corporations over the years. And obviously it's played out in Georgia most recently, but there is a sort of vast and fascinating story of this that will be continuing for some time.
Mark, an announcement this week about Afghanistan on the part of the president. Is this simply a signal to the Taliban that, hey, wait till September and then you could take over? Isn't that a big risk on the part of the White House?
That is certainly central to what critics have pointed to, over the last 24 hours since this announcement came down. Look, this is something that has been, I wouldn't say in the works for a number of years, but look, it's been something that President Obama somewhat was committed to doing throughout his administration. He never got there. Donald Trump certainly talked a lot during his 2016 campaign and through his White House about forever wars. He never really fully got there with Afghanistan. Biden is sort of now going kind of the next step. And there's been all kinds of speculation about what could happen once the troops leave and once there's much less of a military presence or no intelligence presence at all. But look, I guess at this point, I hate to use a cliche, but it's sort of ripping the Band-Aid off a policy that a number of administrations have not been able to sort of shed over the last few years.
Matt, let me ask you about your Cuomo article in the Times Magazine this week. One thing about it in particular I found fascinating: the number of anecdotes you tell, the number of quotes you have in it that are then followed by parenthetical remarks saying, no, that's not what he said according to his people. No, that can't possibly be true. No, that's not Andrew Cuomo. At what point do you decide, even with those denials, that you're sure enough of the fact that that happened, the likelihood that that happened, that is worth printing anyway?
Sure. This was over the course of 2 months, more than 80 interviews. We feel very good, obviously, about everything that's printed. It's worth noting that the Cuomo operation, not on this story, more recently, with a newspaper story, denied something on the record that was later, produced on tape as reported, the remarks that they had denied top to bottom prior to the publication of a tape of the governor's comments. So as you well know, on-record denials do not a false anecdote make.
Yes, that's certainly true. Have you heard from the governor yet? You're still standing. That's a good sign. Or sitting.
I'm still standing. As of a couple days after publication, we'll see where we go.
Okay, I want to follow up with you on that. Let me go back to Mark a minute, though. The border crisis, something that it doesn't appear that the White House has anticipated. Are they ginning up at all on that? Are they doing anything more than they were doing before in a crisis that seems to be getting bigger, certainly bigger than they expected, and seems to be growing all the time?
Yeah, I don't, I mean, look, I think they clearly expected this to be a not easy problem. I don't think they anticipated the magnitude of it. It's clear that this is getting a whole lot of, attention inside the White House. We haven't seen many concrete measures other than trying to sort of flood the area with resources and with people, and the messaging has changed a little bit. But no, I mean, I think that, look, it's a big, intractable problem. It has flummoxed any number of presidents over the years. It seems to be coming to a head again, and I think it's in pretty stark relief to the Trump years, which had its own very, very distinct kind of turmoil at the border, very palpable, very destructive. I mean, depending on how you look at this. And I think that President Trump himself and a number of people close to Trump have used this as a kind of a cudgel to sort of critique someone who has so far kind of evaded a lot of criticism. So, look, I don't know. I think this is a long-term problem. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon.
Matt, one of the themes of your Cuomo profile is that he is trying to forge ahead with government, with governing, I guess in the hopes that the other problems he's having will, if not go away, will at least be overshadowed. One of the things that I find striking that hasn't really been addressed substantively is the nursing home situation and COVID. In your research for this article, did you find any substantive problems with how the state reacted to nursing home? Forget a minute about covering up what actually happened, but did people die as a result of the state's policy? And was that a mistake? Was that anyone's fault? Or was that just in the normal course of having to deal with a problem that was unprecedented?
They certainly dispute, obviously, that anyone died as a result of the policy. There are analysts who have taken issue with that. The underlying policy, again, this was in the course of, a 1,000 decisions being made a second, a little hyperbolically in the early days of COVID. They have stood by every decision that they made in that regard. And I do, obviously, it's under investigation federally. The legislature has made it part of their impeachment inquiry. But certainly it is, in their mind, still an open question as to whether they did anything wrong at all in the underlying policy discussion. The sort of aftermath of how they communicated the total number of deaths among nursing home residents is obviously a separate question, but the policy itself remains very much a sort of contested issue.
Mark, let me ask you one last question, if I might. Policing in America, what do we think the impact of the George Floyd verdict will be on the state of the nation, on Black Lives Matter, on reaction to policing? And does the administration have a policy on policing?
I hate to say I don't know, but I mean, we will see what the verdict is. And I think a lot of people are very nervous about how it's going to play one way or the other. Look, I mean, President Biden has been extremely vocal about the need for some sort of policing reform. He's been very careful not to use phrases like defund, things that Republicans have just been dying for him to say, and have been trying to be very, very critical about Democrats about saying. I mean, they would love nothing more than to characterize Democrats as a soft on crime and anti-police party, which is how they spent much of previous decades doing. Look, I mean, there have been any number of task forces, meetings in place that the Biden administration has talked about as far as reforming policing. Obviously, as the president himself has said, this is coming down to a community level. The federal government can provide as much guidance as possible. The Justice Department can provide as much guidance as possible. But ultimately, this is something that society-wide is going to have to shake itself out.
Thanks to Mark Leibovich, Matt Flegenheimer of the New York Times. And coming up next, the state of play in the race for mayor of New York. The Democratic mayoral primary is about 10 weeks away, and the next person to move into Gracie Mansion will have their hands full. The Partnership for New York City says the city has lost 500,000 private sector jobs since March 2020, tens of thousands of small businesses as well. 5,000 restaurants have closed. The Times reports that with 10 weeks to go, the race is finally heating up. Quote, after months of conducting virtual fundraisers and endless round of online mayoral forms, candidates are sharpening their attacks, ramping up their in-person campaign schedules, preparing to spend millions of dollars that several candidates have stockpiled, but few have spent on public advertising. Andrew Yang is on top in what little polling there has been, which some find surprising given all the wins by progressives in the last few years. Wait, could Andrew Yang really be New York's next mayor? That was the headline in a column in Sunday's Times. Let's talk about the race for City Hall with Dana Rubinstein, a Times Metro political reporter, and Jeff Mays, also a political reporter. Jeff, what is it that we think people are looking for in this race? We've got a lot of choices. We've got the Working Families Party this week coming out for Scott Stringer. We have various unions supporting various candidates. Are they all going to cancel each other out, or is someone in the next 10 weeks going to emerge as some sort of consensus choice?
Well, I think the state of the city is what is probably at the top of most people's minds. As you mentioned, the economic situation is bad. You know, people have lost jobs. The subway is still not running 24 hours a day. There's just been this uptick in homicides and shootings in particular, which are very alarming. So I think the next mayor is not only going to have to chart a course on how the city actually recovers from the pandemic, but there's also calls to make the city better than it was, to address things such as policing and the economic and health issues that were exposed during the pandemic. So, you know, that is really at the top of voters' minds. It appears to be, at this point, the two leading candidates are actually moderates. Andrew Yang and Eric Adams are both considered moderate Democrats for their point of view. So in spite of the gains progressives have made, the city's interests appear to be lining up with two moderates at this point in the campaign anyway.
Dana, you and Katie Glick wrote that story the other day that there's a disappointment among liberals or progressives that with a number of their gains in the past year or two, the moderates appear to be leading in this mayoral race, although frankly, I think it's awfully early, and with ranked choice voting, I don't know how anyone can handicap this race. But why do you think that is? Are they better known? Is it popularity? Is it people who have run for office before? And is this, at this point in the campaign, really very meaningful at all?
Those are all extremely good
mouthful.
questions whose answers will hopefully materialize over the next several weeks. I think to Jeff's point, there are concerns around crime, rising shootings that calls to defund the police don't necessarily ameliorate those concerns for a lot of more moderate Democrats. But I do think it is way too early to tell. I mean, there's virtually no credible polling. That polling which we have shows that something like half of those polled are undecided, and many are unfamiliar with the candidates. Andrew Yang has really superior name recognition thanks to his presidential run. Eric Adams has really strong institutional ties, but it's too soon to say. And then on the flip side, the folks who are running as progressive Democrats, there are several of them, and progressives as a group have yet to sort of coalesce behind any single progressive candidate, which sort of dilutes their influence. And you saw that to some extent with the Working Families Party endorsement, right? They didn't coalesce either because they couldn't. All of their constituent parts couldn't agree on one candidate. So instead they endorsed three. Granted, they endorsed in order of preference, and in the apparent hope that voters will rank those three candidates in that order. But this is our first ranked choice voting mayoral election, and I don't know how voters will comport themselves in the voting booth and whether they will in fact vote for slate as they've been instructed to.
Jeffrey, what's going to happen after the election, after the primary, assuming, of course, that the Democratic primary is tantamount to election in November? How are they going to comport themselves after that vote, when it's probably not likely anyone is going to emerge with any kind of mandate, and with ranked choice voting, people's first choice may very well not win?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but it is likely that the winner of the Democratic primary will likely be the winner, just because of the math that, Democrats outnumber Republicans at least 6-1 here in the state. And so I think the person that wins the Democratic primary is going to have a lot of work to do. They're going to have to go around. They're going to have to gather consensus. They're going to have to bring these sort of different elements of the city together that were competing against one another. So there's going to have to be outreach to the business community, right? What happens to all of these buildings in Midtown that are empty right now? How do we bring people back safely? How do we restore the subways? At the same time, policing is an issue that we see right now with the trial of George Floyd, and the death of Dante Wright in Minnesota is a national issue. It's not going away. New York City has had very similar incidents recently as well. So this person is going to have several months. It's going to be unusual. They're going to have several months as possibly the sort of mayor-elect in a way before the November elections, where they're going to have to try to coalesce all these different issues together behind their candidacy.
Dana, not too many people have stopped me in the street and said, oh, what's this about Andrew Yang, or I'm going to vote for him or not. A lot of talk, though, in the press about Andrew Yang. Does he really have a chance to be mayor, sort of coming out of the blue like this with a platform that perhaps is more or was more presidential than municipal? Or is it a question of name recognition at this point?
Well, it may well be a question of name recognition, but that matters. Yes, I think he does have a very reasonably good chance, maybe not very, reasonably good chance to win, definitely. He has something that nearly all of the other candidates seem to lack, which is really innate charisma. A lot of people find him appealing. Charisma is not something that you can buy or that your consultants can instill in you. You either have it or you don't. People like him, and a lot of the or people don't like him. He's fairly polarizing, and a lot of the gaffes that he's made just sort of slide right off him. They don't seem to make a dent in how people feel about him, and I think a lot of that is driven by his charisma, but also by the notion that he is an outsider, and that he will somehow, by virtue of being an outsider, be able to grapple with a lot of these big issues in a way that folks who have been sort of steeped in city government for decades won't be able to. That is the argument that people make for him, and it seems to be persuasive to a lot of people. It is still extremely early, but yes, he certainly has a chance to be mayor.
Jeff, in Matt Flegenheimer's article in the Times Magazine this week about Andrew Cuomo, Kathy Wild of the Partnership in New York City is quoted as saying she's never seen political instability in New York like there is now, no chain of command, complete anarchy. And that sort of goes to what Dana is talking about in terms of people perhaps looking for an outsider. But there are a lot of outsiders in this race, an unusual number. If you look at Shaw Donovan, Ray McGuire, Catherine Garcia, and others. So what is going to make people choose one outsider over the other, or an outsider at all for that matter?
What I think is going to happen is that, because of what was going on in the country nationally with the presidential election, and then with the Capitol riots, and then with the scandals that the governor is facing in terms of the nursing homes and sexual harassment, I'm not sure voters were that tuned in to the mayor's race. So I think what's going to start happening now is 10 weeks left now. As we get to 6 weeks, 5 weeks, I think voters are going to be very much tuned in, and they have lots of money to spend. Eric Adams has several $1 million. Scott Stringer has several $1 million. They are all planning to spend a good chunk of that money on advertising at the end of the race. There are independent expenditure committees, both for Ray McGuire and Sean Donovan as well. So what they're going to try to do is define themselves in these final weeks with a ton of money, with a ton of advertising. Voters are going to be flooded. Certainly, Andrew Yang is going to be the target of some of those ads. They're going to want to try to tell people who they think Andrew Yang is and why they are the better choice. So yeah, I think it's still up in the air. Just because Yang is in the lead right now does not mean that won't change in the last few weeks. And I'm expecting these last few weeks to be pretty explosive.
Dana, very, very quick last question. We
Mhm.
wrote about efforts by Stephen Ross and others to get more people to enroll, to switch registration to Democrats. Have we seen any evidence that that's going to have an effect on the Democratic primary?
From what I understand, the impact as far as switching parties before the enrollment deadline passed was pretty limited. I do think Ross and his brethren would be happy with either a Yang or an Adams mayoralty, to be frank. So we'll see.
Okay, thanks to both of you for joining us, Jeff Mays and Dana Rubinstein of the New York Times. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.